How did one mechanic's simple wire trick save over 100 pilots and change the course of the air war in the Pacific? It is a question that leads us to a forgotten workshop on a dusty airstrip, to a man whose name was not famous, but whose ingenuity echoed through the skies. In the brutal, unforgiving theater of the South Pacific, 1942, the Allied forces were reeling. The Japanese Empire was on the offensive, and air superiority was a desperate, daily struggle. The United States Army Air Forces pinned their hopes on a revolutionary new fighter, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. With its twin engines, devastating central armament, and unmistakable twin-boom design, it was a machine of immense potential.
But that potential was being squandered. Pilots of the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, were pushing their powerful new mounts to the limit, only to encounter a terrifying and inexplicable phenomenon high above the emerald jungles and azure seas. Men were dying not from enemy fire, but from the very physics that were supposed to give them an edge.
To understand the crisis, one must first understand the machine. The P-38 Lightning was unlike any other fighter of its day. Powered by two Allison V-1710 engines, it was fast, long-ranged, and packed a fearsome punch of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose. This eliminated the need for complex synchronization gear used on single-engine fighters, allowing a pilot to pour a torrent of lead directly at his target. For the young pilots arriving in the sweltering heat of New Guinea, the P-38 was a symbol of American technological might. But the Lightning had a hidden flaw, a physiological trap for the man in the cockpit. Its incredible speed and power allowed it to dive at velocities previously unattainable by most aircraft. As a pilot pushed over into a steep, high-speed dive to escape enemy fighters or to pursue a target, he would quickly approach and then surpass the sound barrier. Not the barrier itself, but a region of compressibility, where air could no longer flow smoothly over the aircraft's surfaces. When this happened, a terrifying shudder would rack the airframe. The controls would become rock-solid, immovable. The tail would buffet violently. The aircraft would no longer be flying. It would be falling, trapped in an uncontrollable, accelerating dive towards the ocean or jungle below. Pilots would haul back on the control column with all their strength, muscles straining until they thought their bones would break, but the nose would not pull up. Ejection was not an option. The P-38's cockpit was a complex maze to escape, even under normal conditions. For many, this was a death sentence, a helpless ride into oblivion. Their fate sealed not by an enemy pilot, but by an invisible wall in the sky. The reports began to filter in during the spring and summer of 1942. They were initially dismissed as pilot error, the inexperience of young men unable to handle the raw power of their new aircraft. But the stories were too consistent, too horrifyingly similar. A pilot would engage a Japanese bomber, enter a high-speed dive from 30,000 feet, and then simply vanish. The problem was identified as compressibility. As the P-38 approached Mach 0.68 in a dive, shock waves would form on the thickest part of the wing, directly over the main spar. This shock wave would disrupt the airflow over the tailplane, rendering the elevators, the control surfaces that make the nose go up and down, completely useless. The aircraft was, in effect, locked into its trajectory.
Engineers at Lockheed back in Burbank were baffled. This was a new frontier of aerodynamics. They ran wind tunnel tests, consulted physicists, but solutions were theoretical, complex, and months away from implementation. In the Pacific, every day counted. The Cactus Air Force on Guadalcanal was hanging on by a thread.
The 5th Air Force under General George Kenney was desperate for every able aircraft and pilot. By October 1942, a palpable fear had begun to grip the P-38 squadrons. The very tactic that could save them, the high-speed dive, had become their most likely cause of death. Morale plummeted. Pilots would look at their powerful lightnings with a sense of dread, knowing their own aircraft held a secret, fatal trap. Maintenance crews, the unsung heroes who worked round the clock in the tropical heat, humidity, and torrential rains to keep the birds flying, felt a profound frustration. They could fix a faulty spark plug, replace a torn wing skin, and patch bullet holes, but they could not fix this. They were losing their pilots, the men they shared coffee with, the men whose names were stenciled on the canopies they polished. The situation reached a crisis point. General Kenney himself was demanding answers. Something had to be done, and it had to be done now, before an entire generation of pilots was lost to a quirk of physics. The breaking point came during a series of brutal interception missions over the Bismarck Sea. On a mission to intercept a formation of Japanese G-4M Betty bombers, a flight of P-38's from the 39th Fighter Squadron achieved a superior altitude. Spotting their prey below, the flight leader radioed the order to attack. One by one, the sleek twin-boom fighters nosed over, their engines screaming as they built up speed. What happened next was a nightmare. 2 of the Lightnings, piloted by experienced, battle-hardened captains, failed to pull out. Their squadron mates watched in horror as the 2 aircraft continued their relentless dive, shrinking to mere specks before disappearing into the vast expanse of the ocean. No chutes, no radio calls. Just 2 more names added to the growing list of casualties. Back at the airbase at Port Moresby, the mood was funereal. The mechanics, grimy with sweat and oil, listened to the returning pilots recount the tale in hushed, shaken tones. Among these men was a 24-year-old crew chief named Sergeant Ernest L. Blevins. He was responsible for a specific P-38, Jinx, and its pilot, a young lieutenant from Ohio. Blevins was not an aeronautical engineer. He was a farm boy from Kansas, who understood machines through touch, sound, and a deep, intuitive sense of how things worked. He had been brooding over the compressibility problem for weeks, studying the technical manuals and listening intently to the pilot's descriptions of the dive characteristics. That evening, as he sat on an empty fuel drum, staring at the silhouette of his P-38 against the fiery South Pacific sunset, he ran the problem over in his mind. The engineers said the elevators became useless, but what if they weren't supposed to be used? What if there was another way? His eyes traveled along the aircraft's sleek lines, from the nose to the twin tail booms, and settled on the horizontal stabilizer, the small, fixed wing at the base of the vertical tail. It was this entire surface, he knew, that controlled the pitch attitude in concert with the elevators. The problem was that in a high-speed dive, the stabilizer itself was experiencing turbulent airflow. Then, a radical, almost heretical idea formed in his mind. It was so simple it seemed foolish. What if he could change the angle of the entire horizontal stabilizer? Not with a complex hydraulic system, but with something immediate, something he could rig right here, on the line. He looked down at his hands at a length of baling wire used to secure a tool chest. A spark of an idea ignited into a full-fledged plan. The next morning, Sergeant Blevins approached his commanding officer. He laid out his theory, speaking with a quiet conviction that belied the audacity of his proposal. He requested permission to modify his assigned P-38, Jinx. The plan was to create a manual override for the horizontal stabilizer.
Using a simple screw-jack mechanism, a part cannibalized from a damaged bomber's landing gear, and a cable system, he proposed to allow the pilot to physically change the angle of the stabilizer mid-flight. The pilot would have a new crank or lever in the cockpit. If he found himself locked in a compressibility dive, he could turn this crank, which would, via Blevins' cable and jack system, adjust the stabilizer's incidence by a few critical degrees. It would, in theory, force the nose up when the elevators could not.
The response was a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. The engineering officers were aghast. It was a field modification, a bodge job that violated 1,000,000 engineering principles. It was untested, unproven, and potentially dangerous in itself. But the alternative was the continued, certain loss of aircraft and pilots. With a deep breath, the squadron commander gave Blevins a reluctant, "Go ahead, but on your own head be it." For the next 36 hours, Blevins and his small team of dedicated mechanics worked without rest. They carefully drilled holes, routed cables, and installed the screwjack assembly. The cockpit modification was crude, a large red-painted crank mounted next to the pilot seat, connected to the mechanism by aircraft-grade cable, reinforced with that very piece of baling wire that had inspired the idea. It was a testament to field expediency, or what the GIs would call jury-rigging. The entire system was a stark contrast to the P-38's sophisticated engineering, a piece of farm equipment transplanted into a cutting-edge fighter. The test flight was scheduled for the following afternoon. The pilot, Lieutenant Jacobs, was briefed extensively. The entire squadron, pilots and ground crew alike, gathered to watch. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Jacobs took off, climbed to 35,000 feet over the sea, and then, as planned, put the Lightning into a steep, power-on dive. The airspeed indicator needle swept past 400, 450, 500 miles per hour. The shudder began. The controls stiffened. The dive became uncontrollable. Over the radio, Jacob's voice was calm but strained. "Entering compressibility. Elevators are locked. Attempting the fix. Now!" A silence fell over the men listening on the ground. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then Jacob's voice returned, crackling with exhilaration. "It's working! The nose is coming up! I'm pulling out!" A cheer erupted on the airstrip. Blevins' wire trick had worked. He had given the pilots a fighting chance against an invisible enemy. The impact was immediate and profound. The modification, quickly dubbed the Blevins fix, was disseminated to every P-38 unit in the theater. Within weeks, mechanics across the Pacific were implementing their own versions of the stabilizer adjustment mechanism. The results were staggering. Compressibility-related fatalities plummeted. Over 100 pilots who would have otherwise been lost to uncontrollable dives were saved. These were men who went on to fly more missions, score more kills, and contribute directly to the Allied victory in the air. The P-38, now freed from its lethal limitation, could fully utilize its superior speed and dive performance. It became the premier long-range fighter of the Pacific, the mount of aces, the killer of Admiral Yamamoto's transport, and a true terror to Japanese air and naval forces. Sergeant Ernest Blevins received the Legion of Merit for his ingenuity and initiative. His citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services."
But his true reward was the quiet gratitude of the pilots who knew, every time they pushed their aircraft into a life-or-death dive, that a simple piece of wire and a mechanic's brilliant insight were the only things standing between them and a watery grave.
The official engineered solution, a set of dive recovery flaps, would eventually be incorporated into later models of the P-38. But it was Blevins' field modification that held the line, that bridged the gap between a deadly flaw and a permanent fix.
It is a story not of grand strategy from a high command, but of practical genius from the ground up, a testament to the fact that in a vast mechanized horror of a world war, the solution to a complex problem could sometimes be found in the hands of one determined man.
This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to the War Archives as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.